Hi, I'm Kelly Markson, and I will be covering Chapter 9 with you. Chapter 9 begins the International Finance section of the course, which is covered from Chapters 9 through 12. In this chapter, our focus will be on the basics. By the time you finish the chapter, you should have a solid understanding of the balance of payments. The balance of payments is basically a record of the economic transactions between residents of one country and the rest of the world. So on one side of the balance of payments is what we call the current account, and that's mostly composed of the trade for goods and services. On the other side of the balance of payments is the financial and capital accounts, and that's what I'd like to think of as the money side of trade. So very quickly, using a simple example, consider if I go and buy a gallon of milk from the store. And suppose that milk costs $4. So the value of the milk, or the value of the good, which is represented in the current account, is $4. And the value of the payment, what is actually paid for in monetary terms, is $4. So these two things should balance out. And that's the basic idea of the balance of payments. The balance of payments should be zero. So what we're going to be doing in this chapter is we're going to define our terms. We're going to look at each of these ideas, the current account and financial and capital accounts, in a little bit more detail. So we're going to, kind of break them down a little bit. We're going to then after that, we're going to use an algebraic model to relate the current account to savings, investment, and the government budget balance. So here we're going to be doing a little review of macroeconomics. And at the end of the chapter, we're going to look at some of the pros and cons of having a current account deficit, which is what the United States has been doing for quite a while. And finally, we're going to look at a country's international investment position and relate it to the current account balance. So the international investment position is basically if we take all the domestic assets owned by foreigners and subtract it from all of the foreign assets owned by domestic residents of a home country. And what are we left with? So we are going to relate that idea to the current account balance. Okay, so let's get started. The balance of payments is basically composed of three different parts. So the current account is the record of goods and services into and out of a country. The financial account is the record of the flow of financial capital to and from the country. And the capital account is the record of some specialized type of relatively small capital flows. So, as I said, as part of the balance of payments, on the one side we have the current account. On the other side, we have the financial and capital accounts. Of the two of these things, the financial account makes up a much, much larger portion than the capital account. And we'll examine them in greater detail. So, to start with, we're going to talk about the current account, which is the trade of goods and services. Before we get started, we need to define a trade balance, and that basically measures the difference between exports and imports of goods and services. So a country has a trade deficit if it has a negative trade balance, meaning that it imports more than it exports. For example, in 2008, the United States had a trade deficit of nearly $700 billion. A trade surplus, on the other hand, is when we export more than we import. So that means there's a positive merchandise trade balance. And the U.S. basically had a trade surplus in services of $144 billion. So while our overall trade deficit was negative, we had a trade surplus in services but we had a much larger trade deficit in goods and services. So the current account balance measures all current non-capital transactions between a nation and the rest of the world. So it has three main components. The trade in goods and services, which is the value of goods and services exported minus the value of imports. It also includes investment income, and this is mostly composed of income from dividends or interest payments. And finally, unilateral transfers. This equals any foreign aid or other transfers received by foreigners. This can be both public or private. Okay, so in table form, you can see that we have our three components of the current account. Keep in mind that there is both a credit side to it as well as a debit side. So, for example, in the trade for goods and services, there's the goods that we sell to foreign nations, and there's also, on the flip side, the debit part is the goods that foreigners sell to the United States. Similarly, there's, for investment income, it's the income that we receive on foreign investments. For example, if I own Japanese stock and I earn a dividend on that, that's income I receive. But we have to subtract out the income that we pay to foreigners on their U.S. investments. Likewise, for unilateral transfers, there's the money that we receive from abroad minus the money that we send to foreigners. So table 9.2 takes a look at the U.S. current account balance for 2011. You'll notice that we have a big deficit in terms of the trade of goods. We have a surplus, however, for the trade of services. So we export more services than we import. Investment income and unilateral transfers are a much smaller component. Overall, our current account balance is negative by just under $500 billion. Figure 9.1 gives us a timeline of the current account from the 1960 to 2011 period. And you can see that there are two big drops in the current account. One started around the early 1980s. We had a big drop in the current account. We went into surplus just briefly in the early 1990s, and then we have been in deficit ever since. So we're going to be talking a little bit later in the chapter about whether this should be a big concern for us. So we went from being having more balanced trade in goods and services to being at a big deficit. So large deficits, as I just showed you on the previous slide, large deficits in the current account began in about 1982 and have been more or less a constant feature of the U.S. economy. That second drop began in the early 90s and continues today. So the current account deficit, should we be concerned about it? Here's the thing. I have a current account deficit with McDonald's. I buy more from McDonald's than I sell to them. In fact, they're not interested in my economics lectures. Is that a concern? Probably not. The issue is not whether we're in a current account deficit. It's why we're in a current account deficit. So if I borrow $100,000, can you tell me whether that's a good or a bad thing? Probably not. It depends on what I use that $100,000 for. If I use it for investment purposes, then that probably was a good decision. If I use it just to, have fun and party all the time, probably not. So it's not the fact that we are in a current account deficit that is a bad thing. We need to examine why we are there. So in the next section of the PowerPoint, we are going to continue with the other side of the balance of payments and look at the financial accounts as well as the capital accounts.